And thank you, everyone. It's great to see so many people here. And I think that's a sign, really, of how we're seeing a whole new energy and determination and focus on climate change, which has really changed, I think, in the last few months. Of course, it desperately needs to, but it's really encouraging that we are seeing that happening. And I think the top line out of this, because you always want to say, how did it all work out in the end? And talking to a lot of the people who, spend their whole day worrying about how many brackets are left in the final declaration and worrying about the particular word and where the comma goes, what they said was they got to the end and said it was a much better outcome than they expected. And that's pretty good when you think about the state of the world, when you think about Trump, when you think about what's happened in Brazil with the election of the right-wing populists there. People were saying, we're happy with where we've got to. And they were even saying next, which was quite miraculous, because I booked the sleeper train to Prague on the Saturday night, because it's supposed to finish on the Friday, but no one really expects it to finish on the Friday night. It never does by tradition. But usually, people thought it would be finished by about lunchtime Saturday. And I had to go and catch the sleeper train, and they still hadn't finished. In fact, they hadn't even started the final plenary. So even after all of that, people were happy. So that's a pretty good outcome. I thought I'd do the good, the bad, and the ugly as a kind of summary of starting with this. But because I believe in being positive, I'm going to start with the ugly and work up to the good. So the ugly you could actually see from Katowice itself. One morning I was there, and I was just walking down to the venue, and there was a giant pile of coal in the centre of town on the pavement. And there was actually one man who was shoveling this into the coal hole of what someone on Twitter, a poll on Twitter later told me, was actually a local high school. And that was running their boiler. And interestingly, of course, I took a photo of the man, and he saw me take the photo and came running over. Clearly there's some official embarrassment about this fact, because he said, don't take that photo of me, delete that photo. So by sign language, I ended up deleting the photo, so I just ran a photo of the pile of coal, not of him. Which, I didn't want to get him into any trouble. But what you could actually, and I think this really awakened lots of people who weren't aware of this, what you could tell every minute you're in Katowice, particularly on the days where the air was really still, you could smell the coal in the air, and you could feel it in your lungs. There was the Katowice cough. And like most people, I left with a Katowice cough, and I had to leave Katowice to get rid of the cough. So the horrors of coal were really being driven home to everybody there in a very practical way. And one of the things that was really new, and I've been to 3 different COPs. I went to Marrakesh and I was in Bonn last year. One of the things that was really new and big and really visible this year was the World Health Organization was there, making a really big focus on the reasons why we have to stop fossil fuel is because of the health impacts. In fact, they even made a claim to say that basically, to stop using fossil fuel, the savings you would make financially would actually pay for the cost of stopping using fossil fuel. And to see the WHO there being such a strong force, having big high-level meetings, being very official, was something that was really positive. But actually what's going to happen, and what we were starting to see, is it's already moving on. This was the last COP where I think coal is going to be a serious topic of discussion. I mean, many people might have seen, the Polish government is still very keen on coal, even though it's very interesting that about 70% of the coal being used in Poland now is actually imported from Russia. And no one will invest in Polish coal mines anymore, so they're actually really expensive, and it's not working. And I was actually at an economics conference in Poland, a good 12 months ago now, and I was actually listening to a Polish senior steel manager saying that he was really concerned about the government's focus on coal because it was going to be difficult for him in a year or few years' time, because his electricity was going to be expensive from coal and he was going to be competing against people with renewable energy that was going to be cheaper. So his costs were going to be higher because of that government focus on coal. So I think this was the last time coal was going to be an issue. The coming issue, which ties to what I was talking about earlier in terms of fracking, is gas. And there are still people there at COP promoting gas and not just the obvious Saudi Arabias. I'm afraid to say that includes the British government. The British government, we can regard this as some kind of progress, because the way this works is there's large parts of COP that are pavilions of various national governments, where they hold events and where they do a kind of stall for what they're doing for climate change. So the good news is that unlike in Bonn last year, we were not this year promoting coal bed methane, extreme radical energy. We were just promoting gas, so it wasn't quite as bad. But if you look at the work of the NGOs, they're very much fighting the battle, and I think this will be the big battle at the next COP, which will be in Chile, is going to be to say gas is just totally out too. Coal is clearly on the way out and is going, but we've got to fight the gas and win the gas battle now, because the problem, of course, is once you lock us in to gas, you can't open a gas-fired electricity power station one day and a year or two later close it down. Which is where we've got to keep fighting, and why that fracking fight here is really important as part of that broader struggle. So that's the ugly, the coal and the gas. The bad, and I may be being a little unfair here, I'm going to put in the bad category the fashion industry, because they do actually deserve some credit. For the first time ever, there was a fashion industry event at COP. And as you'd expect, they had really good canapes at their reception. And better than lots of people, they do get a mark for this. They had vegetarian canapes at their, which is one of the things that happens every year, and it's a big cultural battle, is how much meat is served at COP. And that's an issue. So, the fashion industry was there, and they said lots of good things about cutting the energy use of their factories, and cutting the energy use of their shipping, and cutting the energy use of their shops. And even there was a bit of reducing waste in the supply chain. The question that I got to ask at this event was, yes, and what about having just less fashion, less stuff? Because in the first week I was at an event with a very good figure from an NGO who said that in the global north, if we wore our clothing for twice as long, which given a great many garments are worn a handful of times at most, would not be very difficult. If we wore our garments for twice as long, or they were made to last twice as long, that would halve the carbon emissions from the fashion industry. And to just put that on in terms of scale, the fashion industry produces as much emissions as aviation and maritime shipping combined. So this is a really significant thing. And of course what this also brings in is the broader point, and something that's starting to appear around COP, although there's a huge way to go on this, is of course we can't just think, when we're making decisions and thinking about what's happening, we can't just think about climate change, and huge as pressing as that is. We saw what happened when governments started to promote diesel engines because they wanted to reduce the emissions. Diesel emissions emitted less carbon than petrol ones did, but they didn't think about the air pollution. And so we have to look at all of these things in a holistic kind of way and think about the impacts on human health, the impacts on human food supplies, all of these things together. And if we think about fashion, of course, we think about water use with cotton, we think about pesticide use with cotton. And then on the other side of this, something I know many people in this room do a lot on, there's the whole issue of plastics and microplastics. And basically about 60% of the fibres used in the world are synthetic fibres. Another word for that is plastic. And actually, perhaps slightly surprisingly, the Women's Institute is doing a big campaign trying to campaign about microfibres from clothing. That's synthetic clothing. So you've got a problem with synthetics, and you've got a problem with cotton and other natural fibres. So it has to come down to less stuff. And I had a very nice chat with the corporate sustainability man from Puma. They are clearly very much seen as leaders in this area. And he actually told me that they are very concerned about plastics, and there's a lot of research going on in the industry at the moment. And one of the things they're looking at is potentially they might wash every garment before it leaves the factory, and that might massively reduce the amount of material that all shed. So there's all these things that are going on. And in terms of the bad, well, I suppose we've got to actually mention, okay, I am going to do it, the T word, Trump. The Americans were there. The Americans, of course, have announced that Trump has announced he plans to pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement. That can't actually happen. The way the laws are is it would happen in 2020 after the next US presidential election. It's a very important election. But the good news side of this is that while the US was there and was being an obstructive force, allied very often with Saudi Arabia, which kind of ties with what we were talking about Yemen issues, human rights issues earlier, there was a big storm in the middle weekend about whether they were just going to note the IPCC report or say we're going to do something about it. Now the good news is the final declaration did not use that weasel word, note. Although some of the people were saying this was something of a storm in a teacup, because actually the IPCC report, this is something that's worth perhaps knowing and using, was actually, it has to be an IPCC report, it has to be agreed by every country in the world. So actually the US has signed up to and agreed to the IPCC report, as has Saudi Arabia. And if you saw what the Saudis were doing through the talks, it might surprise you to know that they, of course, have finally signed up to the final declaration, even though they've been fighting it tooth and nail for 2 weeks. And it's an interesting demonstration, and one of the things that I think why people said it came out well in the end was the whole international order, the kind of pressure that can be put on something like Saudi Arabia, despite all of the things that they're doing. And we can talk about the hideous, unbelievable murder in the embassy in Turkey and all the rest of it. They still will not walk away from the Paris Climate Agreement, despite everything. And so the international order is holding together. And also, what's been happening, and the big thing in Bonn last year, was that US states, a majority of US states have said they're just going to ignore Trump and follow the Paris Agreement anyway. And we saw some further breaking on that because Sydney and Melbourne, the Australian cities, Australia has an absolutely hideous government that's totally pro-coal and wants to bulldoze through the Great Barrier Reef to build an enormous new coal mine. It's not going to happen, the economics don't add up. But Sydney and Melbourne signed up to get rid of coal-fired electricity, in defiance of their national government. And it hasn't quite happened yet, but in Brazil, some of the Brazilian states are following the US lead. So the fact is Trump cannot stop this, cannot stop action against climate change. It's there, and the action is going to happen despite Trump. So okay, I've done most of the bad stuff, so now we get to the nice stuff. One of the good things was, and this was very much Polish driven, was something called the Silesia Declaration. Now Silesia is the region of Poland that Katowice is in. And okay, I should say there's at least one person in this room who can probably pronounce Katowice better than I can. But I practiced a lot and that's the best I can do. But the Silesia region is a very old traditional coal mining region. In fact, sometimes Katowice is described as being like the Sheffield of Poland. Huge amounts of heavy industry, steel, coal-fired, etc. Now what this said, and this is a phrase that's been really coming up through the climate talks, and this is the first time it's had a real formal place. The Silesia Declaration said there has to be a just transition. No one can be left behind. So it's saying, unlike what Margaret Thatcher did to the coal mining regions of Britain, we're not just going to dump people in whole communities and leave them. There has to be plans for places that are dependent on climate damaging industries, climate damaging approaches, to find a way forward so no one is left behind. So the whole just transition has really come from the fringe. I mean, when I was in Bonn, I was at an event with Friends of the Earth and the International Trade Union Organisation, International Trade Union Congress. Then it was on the fringe, now it's very much in the mainstream. So, in Green Party terms, we've always said, and the philosophical basis is economic and environmental justice are indivisible. And that really is increasingly being written into the whole COP agenda, and that I think is really encouraging. The next one might surprise you because I'm actually going to praise a multinational company. which is not something I do very often. But it is actually, it came early and it had a real impact and it was really important. You mightn't have heard of them, but they are very important. Maersk, which is the largest container shipping company in the world. You know, they ship a very high percentage of all of those container vessels around the world. And they announced at the start that they're going to be carbon neutral by 2050. Now, of course, the immediate reaction, you know, for those of us who kind of like, well, 2050, that's way too late. The IPC said we only have 12 years. But as they pointed out, container ships basically last 20 or 25 years. And there's a lot of embedded carbon in a container ship. It's not something you want someone to build and scrap 3 years later. And so by saying they want to be carbon neutral by 2050, that means by, at the latest, 2030, they want to be buying giant container ships powered by something other than fossil fuel. And no such thing now exists. There's a few quite small electric ferries. There's 1 or 2 experiments with hydrogen. But they're saying in 12 years' time, we want to buy the first one of these vessels. Now that's a real challenge, and also I think a real opportunity for some country, some industry to really seize and run with, to then create something that will create a new industry standard in less than a decade. And that's a pretty good outcome, and it's a really important thing. And it's something a bit like DFL last year. I was running around singing their praises because they'd also committed, I've forgotten the date now, but they've committed to go carbon neutral. And they've actually said explicitly, we don't know how we're going to do this. So one of the things that companies have traditionally said, was we'd like to pledge up to this or that target, but we just can't see how we'll do it, so we won't do the pledge until we've got the whole technical route mapped out. But what's happening is people are saying, we're going to do that, and our suppliers, our people, let's all work out the way to do it, but we're going to promise that we're going to get there, and we're going to by hook or by crook get there. And that's, I think, a really important step, because you don't have to know all the answers when you make the pledge, and that's a really big step forward. So, a bit more on the good, just something else to mention. Brazil was supposed to be going to host the next one next year. Because of the elections, they've pulled out, but this is actually a good thing, I think, because it's now going to Chile, which is pretty good. And Costa Rica is actually going to have a really important part in the preparatory and have a real influence on the talks. And that is really important, because one of the things you find when you go around, COP, you're going all the times and hearing from different countries and different angles. And everyone, as soon as there's someone from Costa Rica in the room, you know you're going to hear something brilliant and amazing. Because Costa Rica has no generation of electricity from any fossil fuel. And one of the interesting things is I heard one of their senior ministers was talking about this and saying every 3 or 4 years, the big multinationals come down. And kind of the subtext was, he didn't quite say, but the Americans come down and say, you've just got to have a bit of fossil fuel because you want to electrify your cars, so you're going to have to put some gas-fired power stations in to make that happen. And I asked him, how are you able to resist that? I know politically speaking, and you think about, Costa Rica is this pretty small, vulnerable country. You've got all this diplomatic pressure, all this multinational company pressure. And he said something that I thought was really inspiring, and I think potentially can really show us a way forward in Britain. Because Costa Rica, of course, doesn't have an army. It's really, been politically different since the Second World War. And he said that the fact is, how we can resist this is everyone in Costa Rica thinks they're a green. Even if they actually live the most hideously awful, incredibly horrible lifestyle and, consume the 8 planets worth. They think, I'm a Costa Rican, so I'm green. Now, you might want to challenge that. You might want to think about it. But he was saying this is part of our national identity as a nation. If you're Costa Rican, you're green. And I walked away from that thinking, in the context of what we were talking about earlier, there's really something to think about there. If, we like to think of ourselves with whatever happens with Brexit, we're a bit different. European exceptionalism. We're here on this island on the edge. We've got a different culture, we've done things differently, we do things differently. So how do we make that? We're really different in Britain. We're really, really green. Maybe we should start to think about how we can tie those 2 things together as real possibilities. So I'm going to stop talking in a minute because I do believe that dialogue's better than monologue, and there's a lot to say. But things have really changed from, I'd say, about October when the IPCC report came out. There has been a huge shift. And I think it wasn't really clear in my head until I went to Katowice and saw it, that when we were in Paris, and I was at the protest marches in Paris, and we were really surprised when we got at least the aspiration of keeping warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels in Paris. That was a real shock. I mean, even when I was in Bonn last year, the International Energy Agency was just catching up and starting to do some figures on 1.5. And when that was decided in Paris at the 1.5, it was basically seen as it's a nice sop to the island nations. We're going to see if we can keep one or two of them above water that weren't going to keep above water otherwise. We'll have a go at 1.5, and that'll be nice for those little vulnerable Pacific states. But actually what the IPCC report said, and where we've really shifted, is actually we have to keep it below 1.5 for all of us. And that's where the 12 years comes from. And a final thought, something that I discovered in Katowice that isn't related to Katowice, but it's really encouraged me. Something I hadn't realised, the world moves on and you forget how much it's changed. Twitter was a newborn 12 years ago. You think about how much impact, how central, certainly in politics, Twitter is to political life. And it didn't exist 12 years ago. And Facebook was 2 years old, and hardly anyone had heard of it. So rapid change is a normal part of the human condition. Things can turn around really fast. And I think, we've got to focus on that, focus on the positive. And what I always say is of course we've got to stress the urgency, stress the risks. But we've also got to stress that we've been trashing this planet for the past few decades, creating a really miserable, insecure society with poverty and inequality and desperation and food banks. And the change that we need to make, we don't just need to make it for the planet. We need to move to an entirely different model of society for people too. And it can deliver for people a much better society. Thank
you. Could I ask you a question whether the issue of recycling was discussed at all? Because I think in energetic terms, so this is becoming a big hot potato for us, because traditionally in the green movement, obviously, we have always supported the idea of recycling, and of course we should carry on supporting it. But I think the urgency of the current situation and the problems caused by the recycling industry, also in energetic terms, because it does require energy to recycle, have meant that I think we really need a massive shift in attention from recycling to avoiding a set production, overproduction, and avoiding a certain type of production. It seems to me that for us is not quite as an obvious issue as it might look, because I think we have gradually become aware of the problems with recycling. And also it seems to me it's just fundamental to that issue of the systemic change in the way we operate. And I was wondering whether this has become a mainstream discussion or yet.
I mean, there wasn't a lot of discussion about plastics at all. There was a few sessions, but plastics and recycling were not kind of central. What I would say is, as I said with the fashion industry, the idea of less stuff and selling less stuff is way too radical for very nearly every organisation and every commerce and nearly every government. There is maybe Costa Rica, maybe some of the small island states might really get that growth can't continue. As we say, you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. But it's not there at all. I mean, I actually wrote a piece saying, there's basically, the problem is there's still most of the sessions, most of the events are business as usual, but more efficient and done better. And there's very few things that are less business. And that's, that's still absolute fringe now. In fact, I mean, interestingly, the German government pavilion, if you ever go to COP, the German government pavilion has some of the most radical events. You have to give them credit for that. And so I did go to an event that was headed degrowth, but it was a series of, the most radical NGOs. It wasn't something you heard anyone from the mainstream government saying. So we've still got a long way to go to get to that reduce agenda.
Were the Chinese there? Because in China the issue of recycling is absolutely key, because they used to import all this recycled stuff from all over the world and creating social conditions that were appalling for the communities, basically dying into this huge mass of rubbish that should be recycled. They have stopped doing that.
I mean, I think, again, plastics wasn't a big focus, but certainly the Chinese are there. And the Chinese are very much seen, the Chinese, if you go back to Bonn, the Chinese were the clear leaders really pushing for action, really pushing for decisions on the final declaration. This was actually a bit more balanced because the EU was seen to, the EU was really invisible at Bonn. The EU was wrestling with Brexit and migration and various other things, and they were just not there at Bonn. The EU has stepped back up and is seen to be really, so it's more China and the EU co-equals leading on things. But one of the things actually not particularly related to COP, but I'm working on a report for the European Greens on soil carbon at the moment, which is a very complex and interesting issue, and if you're interested I can really geek at you about that later. But what I've noticed is that looking at reading the journals, the Chinese are absolutely at the forefront of all the research on soil carbon. And a lot of the most radical, interesting stuff is being done by Chinese researchers. And I think it's not very visible to us, but I think there is a huge effort going in China on the research side and the understanding side. And I think the Chinese government really does get, they're not that far away from remembering having mass famines, from having, their whole government collapse, change in system and everything. And so I think there is a really acute awareness in China of the fragility. They're still doing horrendous things, but there is a real determination to change, and of course there is a real potential to change the system very quickly there.
Can you tell us more about the British position? During the 2 weeks, I don't recall seeing much at all from government, any commenting on what was going on or anything like that. So just interested to know more about what you thought on Britain's position at the moment.
Okay, well, one of the interesting things is that Britain is terribly visible. We obviously pay a huge amount of money. So we have the British Pavilion right in the middle with the biggest traffic flow. And just because of the traffic, always there's the biggest jam of people outside it. And boy, do they give away a lot of wine. If you wanted a free wine in the evening, the British Pavilion was definitely the place to go. So there was a high level of visibility for Britain. They were very proudly proclaiming, the biggest sign on it was, "We did the Climate Change Act." A decade ago. In terms of actual participation in the talks, official role, utterly invisible. Michael Gove didn't go. When you hear Michael Gove proclaiming, we do have actually, to be fair, I was talking about coal and Sydney and Melbourne signing up to the declaration of going beyond coal. We do actually have a leadership role in beyond coal. And our minister, the junior minister was there. And, so if you want to credit something, we are quite good in international leadership on getting out of coal generation. But in terms of actually having any impact on the final declaration, having any diplomatic weight, I would say our diplomatic weight was zero, which I think is not really surprising, given the government is just utterly preoccupied with Brexit. So, this is a declaration, a COP declaration that has zero input from Britain. So.
Natalie, we're living in just about the most centralized country in the world. We have local elections coming up. Did you see some themes that came up there that actually could be used in the May elections here on the doorsteps and in Sheffield to promote a pro-climate or an anti-climate change agenda, things that might catch people's attention, you know, that, and particularly, it's a bigger question, but in terms of also winning over working class people to the value, because I think the Green Party is not going to move too far in Sheffield until it in fact reaches out to Hillsborough, or the first Green in Hillsborough, these kinds of things. But things that might sort of attract people in Sheffield about the climate, the world climate change. What this, you know, not Julie Dore's not going to do it, but what are the kind of issues that might turn people on?
I think I made reference to the WHO, the World Health Organization, focusing on the health impacts of the way we live now. And you know, the figures and the practical health impacts are absolutely enormous. And that's something to focus on. But I think also, you know, you can go down to a very small city level. And you know, actually this wasn't specifically at COP, but I've recently, it's a lovely story in Antwerp, the Belgian city. In 2017, the Greens are in coalition, were in coalition running the government there, and it was a Green transport person. And they decided to effectively make the city centre car-free. It's not quite just an absolute prohibition. What it is, it's divided up, sliced up like a pizza. And if you want to drive from one slice of the pizza to the other, you have to go out to the ring road, round and back into the next slice. And so it makes it such like that you're not going to do that almost, you know, it's just not the way that you would travel, unless, you know, if you're moving house and you're moving from your furniture from one flat to another or something, but you wouldn't do it otherwise. And it's essentially car-free. And when this was brought in 2017, it was hugely controversial. I met and talked to the transport guy in charge of it, and you know, he copped huge amounts of flack. In 2019, 2018, they've just had the elections, and there was no party running, including the far right, that said they'd abolish that. The most that the far right said was, well, it's a bit strict and we're going to make it a bit less strict, without actually specifying what they meant by that. And it is now just hugely popular. Doing it, the step of doing it was a big, difficult step. But now no one can imagine it any other way. And the Green vote doubled in those elections that have just been held. So, you know, I think there's a real lesson there that some of these steps, you have to be brave, they're politically difficult. And there are cities all around the world, and you see, you know, case studies of this at COP all the time, cities that are doing amazing things, sometimes in defiance of their national governments. And, you know, it's difficult to do at the time, but afterwards, very often people say, well, why did we ever do anything the other way?
So basically, you know, when you were speaking with the multinational company, was it the shipping?
Yeah, Maersk, yeah.
Yeah, that was. Out of interest, when you were there, was there any like sort of country that were like sort of taking a real interest into this? Like, with in fact, like they were looking for sustainable energy ships in the future. Was there any like sort of country that would take an interest? And like from that, why not us? We were once one of the biggest shipbuilding countries in the world. Why can't we invest in this sort of industry for the better of everybody in this country? Because obviously employment is also a massive down.
That was obviously my immediate thought. Yeah. I think what actually happened was this announcement came in the middle of the first week, and it was totally unexpected. It wasn't signalled at all. No one saw it coming. So I don't think there was time within the COP framework for anyone to really react to that in that sort of time. I mean, the practical reality, of course, in terms of if you look at Britain, is certainly because the industry has just about disappeared, it would have to be a big government effort, a government-supported effort, a government research-led effort to set up to do that. And I'm afraid, you know, I can take a case study of this, or something that I've spent a lot of time and energy on and very frustrated about, is there was the proposal in Cardiff Bay for the tidal energy scheme. And that was a small, sort of relatively small proof of concept scheme that the plan was they would build 5 tidal energy lagoons, which could have been in 10 years' time supplying 9% of Britain's electricity needs. And the thing was, we would actually have been the world leaders in this. There was one plant done something fairly similar in France 30 years ago, but France went nuclear instead, so no one's developed it since. And we could have been, you know, absolute world leaders, and actually the people came up to Sheffield, they were talking to the steel makers here, they were talking about setting up a turbine plant somewhere either in the Midlands or in South Yorkshire. There was the whole possibility there, the plan was all there, the government just had to back it with relatively modest amounts of money. The Welsh government was entirely 100% behind it, was actually prepared to find a bit of money themselves, not that they've got a lot of money. And our current government just killed it. So, you know, I agree with you and that's my thought, but you're right that we have to have a very different government. But, you know, I think it also probably wouldn't be one nation thing, realistically. You know, the level of technological change required and the level of sophistication, you know, if you were going to have, say, a hydrogen-powered ship, for example, which is probably, you know, batteries for that kind of scale, the kind of distance, doesn't really quite seem to add up, the experts suggest. It's probably hydrogen. And that's a very, very high-tech level where you're going to have to draw in, you know, skills and knowledge from around the world. So, you know, it'd be great to be building the bulk of it here, but we have to draw in things from around the world, realistically.
Nothing. We're already up to 1.1 degrees of warming. There's at least another 0.2 degrees of warming built in if we stop all emissions now from the ozone, because that will reduce, but that actually cuts out some of the sun's rays at the moment, so when that goes, we get another 0.2 degrees of warming. So that's very close to the 1.5 degrees of warming that you want to say after that it's so dangerous, all the different feedback loops kick in, and we could, you know, be exponentially going up to a completely catastrophic climate. Hasn't COP completely failed? That's the 24th COP. Carbon emissions are still going up. What can we do to actually reverse this?
Well, I think what I said about Twitter and Facebook is something that really encourages me because, and in a way, it's a bit like these big giant container ships. You know, turning around the container ship with the inertia and the pace that it's going, you pull on the wheel and it takes a very long time for things to turn around. There's a lot of really encouraging things out there, one of which is the fact of, you know, one of the reasons why Trump is not succeeding in restoring the US coal industry, US coal use is going down significantly, is because renewables are cheaper than coal to generate electricity. Lots of this technology has come on much faster, and, you know, we've seen India and China basically stop building new coal. You know, that's happening because the economics are actually on our side, totally and utterly. And, you know, I think if you look at how even British public opinion, and even there's some quite good figures on US public opinion too, you know, the IPCC report in October really did see a turnaround. And if you look at the recent Australian elections, there was an election in the Victorian state, in the Australian state of Victoria, and the Conservatives did far, far worse than anyone expected. And climate change, particularly in the cities, is cited as one of the key issues. I mean, they are absolutely hideous. And, you know, very ordinary voters were saying, well, they're hideous on climate change, so we can't vote for them. So I think, you know, if we think of this as like the container ship, we've been tugging on that wheel for a long while, and it's just kept ploughing ahead. We're kind of at the point, you know, in some ways, if we continue the metaphor a bit further, it's kind of dangerous when you broadside to the waves, and that's a bad point. But if you can get it turned right around and start steaming the other direction, powered by hydrogen, for example, you know, human change is the normal human condition. And, you know, of course, we should have started lots more things 5 years ago, but you start from where you are. And I think, you know, there really is the possibility. And, you know, I think there will almost certainly be some overshoot on 1.5. But, you know, the IPCC has 4 different scenarios, one of which has no overshoot at all, which I don't think anyone really believes. The second scenario has a little bit of overshoot. So you go a bit above 1.5 and you pull it back down again. That's the one we really need to be aiming for, because some of the third and the fourth scenarios have a lot of overshoot, and then they start doing really fancy things with carbon capture and storage and making some quite ridiculous assumptions about tree planting and reforestation. So, you know, we will probably overshoot 1.5 a little bit, but I think we can keep it to not much over that 1.5 and pull it back quite quickly once we've turned things around. And something else positive, I've just spent 2 days last week at the Oxford Real Farming Conference. Not to be confused with the Oxford Farming Conference. The Oxford Farming Conference is basically the National Farmers Union conventional one that's been going for 48 years or something. The Oxford Real Farming Conference just had its 10th birthday and is the alternative people. And it talks about agroecology and organics and lots of vegetable growing and some quite amazing, wonderful vegetable growing where you can take 1,000 square metres and produce a massive amount of really healthy food off 1,000 square metres. And the interesting thing is, again, I've been to a couple of these, and the Oxford Farming Conference, the NFU one up the road, now sounds just like us. In fact, they're even suggesting, and we don't like this idea very much, but they're even suggesting that maybe they could be combined. So, there's lots and lots of places where we've run the argument. I mean, they're still not actually doing the stuff they're talking about, but they are at least acknowledging that we've won the argument. So there's a lot of change happening in a lot of areas that's really positive.
I'm conscious at this point that we've come to the end of our allotted time. If people are happy to carry on for another 5 minutes or so, I think we can manage that without getting turfed out. I've seen a bit of a hand there.
Right, okay, so I may have missed hands right down there. Yep.
Actually, your question was very similar to what I was going to ask. So could I just ask, did Andrew Cooper get his thing through about local action contributing to national?
Just to explain for those who don't know, there's a Green councillor in Kirklees called Councillor Andrew Cooper, and he's on the European Committee of the Regions, among other things. And he basically originated the whole idea of locally determined contributions. So you've probably heard of nationally determined contributions, which is each nation making its offering of what it's prepared to cut. And what he's saying is, lots of local government, as I've been talking about, is doing lots of positive things, but there hasn't been in the COP process a way of counting those local government towards the whole. Now, of course, you've got to make sure they're not double counted. Basically, he got about, it's a classic COP story, he got about a wording that was about half as strong as he was hoping for in the declaration. But it does mean, and we were talking about what you can achieve at a local level, it does mean a green thing started in Kirklees is now there in the COP declaration. So, from small things you can get a very long way. And, in the nature of how COP works, is maybe next year we'll be able to strengthen the wording more.
Do you detect anything in sustainable economy that Maersk, if it gets its carbon neutral ships, will be shipping vast less tonnage, and emerging nations wanting to up their production to improve quality of life? I mean, in the complicated formulae, is that even on the table?
I think, when you look at both the maritime, Maersk is the good side of maritime. The organisation that governs maritime is the international organisation, the IMO, and that is very, very dodgy and entirely dominated by shipping companies far worse than Maersk. And the maritime plans at the moment assume massive increase in tonnage, and growth in trade. The practical reality is, of course, that's not happening. Their graphs of how they're projecting things look like that, and actually the practical reality is that's not happening. And aviation is, of course, the other area where they're basically still making totally inadequate offerings. So, I come back to the point, people are still, we haven't busted through the business as usual growth paradigm yet.
The leisure shipping with its huge growing touring.
Leisure shipping is an interesting one, actually, in that I think it's just starting to come onto the agenda, and it's an area where two things, which is plastics and air pollution, particularly air pollution, and the pollution caused when they're birthed, is really starting to be a big issue. So I think that's one of those whereby it will be tackled, coming from the sideways, from those kind of practical local environmental impacts. So that's one of the reasons why we've got to join this all up together. The Sustainable Development Goals are there, bringing all of these issues together. Climate change, the state of the oceans, the state of our societies, hunger, everyone getting educated, all of those things are all in there together in SDGs. And one of the things we've got to do is very much join up more climate change agendas, and also with agendas about biodiversity and bioabundance. If you look at what the Committee on Climate Change says, what we have to do in Britain, to store carbon, we've got to do significant rewilding. They don't use that word, but it's what they mean, reforestation. That means, that potentially, if done well, can be brilliant for wildlife. It means we've then got to entirely change the farming system, so we grow far more food off far less acreage. And we probably have some small local biofuel as well. That's a massive change in land use. We've really got to think, the story is change. But the story is, we are an incredibly nature-deprived country. There is almost nothing left of nature in Britain. And tackling climate change, we can also tackle that. So that's how the positives can all come together.
Brilliant.
I've got one more over there. Should we sneak one more in quickly?
Was anything said about population growth and the need to stop the population growing?
Well, I think the interesting thing is actually there's a lot of figures coming out at the moment that shows that actually basically all the estimates are getting lower and lower of where it's going to peak. And levels are going down and down and down. So birth rates are going down and down and down. So there is still growth because life expectancy is increasing. That's a good thing. No one's going to argue against that. In parts of the world where that desperately needs to happen, and we can do with some improvements here. But it's basically women are not having babies anymore in anything like the numbers, and that's happening where there is policy, but also even where the policy isn't being instituted by governments, it's happening anyway. And I think a lot of that is once women see other opportunities, other chances in life, and this is where we often talk about the negative effects of social media, etc. There's a really interesting piece in the New York Times today about how the women of Niger, young women particularly, are really asserting their rights. And it's partly because they've seen on social media that things can be done differently and they want to do it differently. So there's a lot of positive stories happening around the empowerment of women, the impact, and that can have positive impacts.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, Natalie. That's been fantastic.